Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi. This episode is about the opportunity of expanding work options and arrangements beyond borders, into new domains, for employees to be able to have a greater range of experiences and relationships that contribute to improving results wherever your business, customers, and co-workers are based. Venturing beyond your familiar surroundings and earning your keep based in a different state, province, and especially country is a meaningful decision with lasting effects. I know. I've done it multiple times. Experiencing very different daily working operations and interactions, your ability to empathize and recognize people's different contexts across the diversity of their cultures, backgrounds, situations, languages, and opinions increases significantly. You can deepen understanding of prospects, strengthen connections with existing clients, and build better relationships with any colleague, vendor, or partner. More and more companies and countries are offering expansive international employment opportunities as increasing numbers of workers around the world are pushing for more choices about what, where, and how work happens. Some investigation and organization is required to set it up and unleash the multidimensional benefits to economies, business results, and local and multinational employee communities. I'm delighted to be speaking with John Lee, CEO and founder of Work From Anywhere, a business focused on solving tax complexity and compliance for employers and their increasingly distributed workforces. John is a serial entrepreneur who has himself lived and worked in multiple countries. Hi, John. How are you?
Great to be here, Sophie. Thank you for having me here today. I'm great.
You have a very varied career, which always sparks my interest. We have to start at the beginning. You studied accounting, and the first job you had out of college was accounting.
That's right. So for me, it kind of goes back to when I was in college. I remember always having a kind of a burning desire to be an entrepreneur. And a lot of the talks I'd been to from entrepreneurs, those that didn't have a finance background, said they felt it kind of held them back, trying to rely on others. And they kind of described accountancy as like a bit like the language of business. And so, I mean, did I have a burning desire for debits and credits? I certainly didn't. But when I saw it in that lens, that kind of a mindset, I said to myself, okay, let's start this journey on looking into learning about business, seeing it as a language. And plus for me, the beauty about it was very international. So it would allow me to travel around the world, which was also a very, very big part of my values. So that's kind of how that started.
Okay. So then we might have to take a wee step back. How did that desire for entrepreneurship manifest itself before college? Or that was just something you knew that you wanted to do?
Yeah, well, my grandparents on both sides had come from a kind of a farming and an auctioneering background, and my parents, my mum was an engineer, my dad was a doc, but in the wider family, we didn't really have a huge history of entrepreneurialism, even though we had a number of members of the family that had worked in business. But for me, I always been inspired by the kind of crafting something and building something much bigger than yourself, and leaving a bit of an imprint behind for the better. And for me, creating something new. And what I loved about business is that you could tap into this this global network of people all around the world. And for me, I love that concept. That's kind of how that kind of grew for me. And I'd been reading a lot of, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, watching CNBC, all things like that from a very, very early age. And that's kind of how all that grew. Yeah.
Then you go from accounting and you're in an audit and then a controller position, but you're quickly moved to the Netherlands. That sounds like it was something that you leapt at the chance. You wasn't a forced move.
Well, exactly. And so the beauty about doing audit for those first 3 years when I was in Deloitte is that you need to do something like that to become a chartered accountant for a lot of cases, or at least when I was there at the time. And so I did my 3 years in Deloitte, but during that time, it's because I speak 6 languages, 4 of them fluently. Ireland's biggest company,
whoa. You can't just throw that out there. By that point, by your early 20s, you're speaking 6 languages? What?
By that stage, I'd been speaking about five languages, and more or less what happened was that's quite unusual, having a finance background, but also speaking multiple languages.
How do you learn 5 languages by the time you leave college? That really is quite unusual.
Yeah, what happened for me was so when you're in school in Ireland, you learn Irish and you learn English. And then it didn't really teach Irish very well at the time. But what happened was from the age of 12, then you have the option of doing, one other European language. And I chose French, but also German. I started doing some German outside of school at the time at around 15, because I just loved languages. I love the fact that when you speak in somebody's language, you connect with them on a much deeper level. Now, of course, with everything with AI and translation services now, maybe to a degree, you might argue it's potentially redundant in future. But for me at the time, it was a wonderful way of really connecting with people on another level. And so that's what caused me to put the extra effort into,
At that point, you haven't ever visited France or Germany, perhaps?
No, absolutely not. No, I had never visited France. What happened then was when I went into college, I basically wanted to do a business with one of the languages, and I chose the language I was worst at, which was German. I was still good at it, but I knew French for me would come so naturally that I do pick the language I'm worst at, and I get good at that. And then when I was in college, I started learning some Spanish as well, did an intensive Spanish course as well, which actually, once you had French, it became not too bad. But then the beauty about it, that's when I was in Deloitte then all of a sudden they started seconding me to some of their biggest clients on international assignments. And so that's what then kept up the French and the German and whatnot.
So then you go to the Netherlands, which is perfect because you're right there, able to pick up on all those languages.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, but at that point, your job has got nothing to do with languages. You're a controller, but it's a lot to do with logistics and distribution.
And exactly. So what I was basically right hand to the divisional CEO, basically, and I was their lead on the finance and helping touch base on what was going on in the different operations and subsidiaries and the different performance improvement initiatives. But actually, I needed my languages in a massive way. And I'll give an example. So when I was in internal audit in CRH in the head office, we would go and visit all the different operations around Europe and the US, but particularly around Europe. And what was interesting is sometimes you'd go to, for example, a subsidiary in France, and you would visit like a concrete factory or a distribution center in the middle of nowhere in France or Belgium or Germany, for example. And so the auditors that didn't have that language, they ended up having to bring translation, let's say, assistance with them, basically. I would sit down with the plant manager. I would speak to them in their language, in French or German, and I'd have a chat. I'd say, well, how was the weekend? How did you get on? And build a relationship. And then I sit down and say, so look, tell me all the issues you guys have here. And so they give me like 10 A4 pages of here's all the issues. And so the poor auditors on the other side dealing with it who didn't have the language, so they had it much harder. And so I come back with all this list of findings and things we need to improve because I built a relationship in their language, let's say. Yes. So and that kind of continued on when I was a controller and a senior finance leader in the business later on, let's say.
Oh, fantastic. Although potentially at head office, they were like, we don't actually want that much. We don't want to know that many about the issues. We want them to deal with themselves.
Well, it helped me later because I ended up having a great understanding of the businesses and also a great relationship. I mean, I'm very relationship oriented. And again, a lot of it, doing it through that language became really helpful. Yeah.
CultureMee didn't come out of that. That wasn't the first venture you set up.
So it was kind of an inflection point for me. If you think of this, I mean, for me, I got into Deloitte to learn about business and the accountancy and get my qualification. Then went straight into CRH for internal audit for 2 years to get into a big business and then get seconded to the business side of it, financial control, business control, and really get into the operations. But what happened was then at this stage now, I've been pretty much on a 10-year point in my career, and I still had a burning desire to be an entrepreneur. And my mentor at the time, he ended up being HR director of all of CRH. I told him that for me, I still had this desire. And he said to me, John, you have a great career here, but if you do want to become an entrepreneur, do it now and you can always come back. Because if you stay here for another 5 or 10 years, you're going to become institutionalized. It'll be much harder. And simultaneously then my wife, Dee, she had come up with the brainchild, the concept of when we were on a trip to Africa, visiting 5 different countries, about the concept of CultureMee. And at the time, I had, of course, done intercultural training in CRH. I had read intercultural models, and actually I had mentors in CRH that showed me how you can use intercultural data models when you're negotiating M&A targets. And I'd never seen this before. I mean, I knew my personality and how you can, let's say, read different people's personalities. I'd never seen somebody use like intercultural data models when you're actually doing business negotiations or M&A as a guide, as one of the tools you use to try and help understand the other perspectives of other cultures and other people that you're dealing with. And that was mind-blowing. So when Dee came up with the idea of CultureMee, that's where, I said, listen, I want to get involved here, and jump straight into it.
Oh, because I thought you did the business travel thing, but you were still working in...
So the business travel wellbeing community was basically a volunteer community that we set up at the time of CultureMee, where other people in kind of soft skills, intercultural, kind of mental health, physical health, businesses in the business travel space, that together with a few other people, we came together and we said, let's create a community where other similar businesses can share ideas of how you can approach these bigger companies, and also share resources and best practices, because it was also during the pandemic. So there's a lot of people that needed access to mental health resources, physical health, things around the intercultural side of it as well. Because for businesses, folks, it's interesting. If you think of it, Sophie, in business, like startups focusing on saving businesses hard cash, financial metrics, it's much easier to make a business case into these large companies. But businesses that are on the soft skills side, where there is a measurable benefit, but it's harder to convey that. It's harder to get the attention of companies because they're so procurement focused, let's say. So that was the concept behind that. Yeah.
Very much so. That's why I wrote Empathy Works. Was there a particular moment, a particular incident that happened when you were traveling in Africa?
For us, we'd been two people that had traveled the world. We traveled to over 70 countries ourselves. So we had seen a fair bit of the world. And it was interesting. We were basically looking at a lonely planet for a number of these countries that we're going to in Africa. And both of us remember looking at it. We were blown away by these different national cultures and these different people we were meeting. And we kept on saying to ourselves, a lonely planet will tell you a lot about the museums and the nice hotels to stay, for example, but it doesn't talk about the people. And why, if you think of why we travel, you have a map of where you want to get to, but what do you have for a map of understanding the local people? And really peeling back the onion and the layer of the agricultural aspects. And of course, I also had understanding of intercultural data models, that there had been studies done over many decades to talk about, what are some of the aspects that can be common across different cultures, let's say. And so with that, basically, that's where kind of more or less turned up. And we ended up partnering with one of the biggest intercultural, let's say, research companies in the world, had been using intercultural video platform and doing our own research as well to build up CultureMee, which is basically an app to help you go deeper on the people side of when you go to a different country. And so, for example, you had videos from local people and from visitors. So if you're going to the Netherlands, business culture there from both locals and visitors. Also family life. Also, for example, food and drink and different things like that. What are the cultural tips and pitfalls to watch out for example, but not just from the locals, also from visitors and vice versa. So the idea that you have a holistic picture of how to navigate the local people when we go there. Because I think people maybe 20 years ago were going more for the sandy beaches and the museums. Whereas people nowadays are more and more motivated about the people side of it, about understanding, the beauty of the local culture and how to bring it to life.
But it was more of a business app, essentially, of benefit for visitors.
It started off as a B2C app that ended up winning best travel technology product in the world at the Global Travel Awards. So it was basically initially as a free app. And we used that to targeted leisure travelers, basically, and students and whatnot. But then as we were going through it, we were on a number of accelerators, including Booking.com, DC Orion High Flyer Academy, and others. And what became clear is basically leisure travelers, the cost of acquisition is very high because you're competing with the Booking.com and Expedias of the world. But at the same time, we began doing more research, and it became clear that in the business travel space, a lot of business travelers are looking for exactly this kind of information. And so we basically ended up simultaneously speaking to travel management companies in the travel space and business travel, and they were saying, yeah, there's a real need for this. And that's how that kind of evolved.
What I saw in my time living and working in Hong Kong and then in Germany and other places was how much they're trying to negotiate business deals or onboard people who are often not of the same culture and speaking the same language, who are going to be running a remote office for a large international organization. I mean, the challenges that they encountered because they didn't have some of these cultural sensitivities have been enormous in the past. And I think they hopefully do get more cultural direction and training before they go there now. Was that the interest that you were finding?
Well, yeah, the big thing for me was that when I was in CRH, we ended up doing a lot of intercultural training, and kind of the big aha moment was you have to remember, I was like, there was very few expats in the Netherlands from Ireland at that point, like a handful. Yeah,
Okay.
I think I was pretty much the only one that could really like speak Dutch properly. And so what ended up happening was I became like one of the key interfaces between the Dutch kind of a European division office in the Netherlands
Mm-hmm.
and the Irish head office in Belgrade.
Ah,
One of the things that was fascinating was that the Dutch tended to discuss things in a very much a democratic way, but they were very direct in their communication. Whereas Irish people tended to decide in a hierarchical way, but were indirect in how they communicated. And what ended up
mm,
happening was there was a lot of intercultural friction because literally this was the case across the board. And what ended up happening was you'd have some misinterpretation because some people would say, oh, this person is a real pain in the ass. They're not a nice person. Yeah.
right.
And so, but in the end, it was down to their interculture. It was down to that intercultural piece of it, you know?
Sure.
And so for me, that was one of the things that I ended up when were doing those intercultural training courses. We all started going. It was like an aha moment. Wow, we
Yeah,
didn't
yeah.
actually we didn't actually realize it, and all of a sudden it became like more attuned to the fact of the power of that national culture and influence, and how it can influence.
Mm-hmm,
Obviously
mm-hmm.
ourselves or as individuals, our personality, but also the team dynamics as well.
What's so interesting is it's not just the language, it's not just the general culture, but the specific work culture that is so different between countries. And that can have a huge impact, obviously, to that particular situation on how people interpret and misinterpret each other. Fascinating.
And it also happened to me when I was traveling as well. Like so many times, we've all got stories of it. I mean, one of the one that just blew my mind, and I remember reading about this before I went there. But I think was it in Bulgaria? Nodding your head up and down means no, and like,
Mm.
and shaking your head means yes, and so the side to side means
That's a
yes,
big one.
and so when I went and I remember being in Bulgaria and I was waiting outside the hotel and at the taxi I was waiting for a taxi to arrive and then
Hmm.
the lady at reception went out and she pointed at the taxi and said, "Has a taxi arrived?" And she shook her head. Like, okay. She was still standing there. And I was like, a minute later, I was like, "Sorry, when is the taxi arriving?" She says, "Yes, it's here." It's like, I'm even now, as I'm trying to do it,
It's hard,
it's hard to actually do
very
it. And
hard.
so, like that's it. And you also have the Indian nod, for
Yeah,
example,
yeah.
as well. Things like that, for example. So, like things like that, really, what's beautiful about it is that culture is only one part. That national culture is only one part of identity. We have individual personality, and there's lots of
Mm,
other sub identities that can raise to
absolutely.
the surface. But for me, this was one of the ones that I found just fascinating. I'm always curious about it because I have a deep curiosity about other people
Yeah.
and what makes them up. And certainly national culture, when you go abroad, in some countries, maybe it doesn't rise as much to the surface, but in others,
Sure.
it can really come to the surface in a big way, you know?
And sometimes when it doesn't come to the surface, it's when you need to say, hang on a second. I know there's a lot there. I need to step back and not make any assumptions because the
Correct.
fact that it isn't obvious, it does not mean it isn't all there.
Exactly. And at the same time, then there's also the danger of stereotyping as well. Like you want to
Mm,
stay well
mm,
clear of that. I'm also a member of Theatre Europa, the Society of Intercultural Trainers and Researchers, and I was on the board up until recently. And for me, like so much of it is about educating, the world about these brilliant educators and researchers and consultants. That it's really interesting. Like 20 years ago, it was very much about studying national country differences, whereas now it's
mm.
going much broader into
Right.
diversity, equity, inclusion, and beyond,
Mhm.
and more that kind of more of an agile mindset, let's say, which is quite interesting, you know.
Yes, very much about the mindset. That's where I start. And without the mindset, it's very hard. I had traveled quite a lot in Europe with my family, and then going to China was a whole reset because it was so incredibly different that I couldn't use the same assumptions. That really helped expand my mindset at the time. So then CultureMe, you're doing that in the pandemic. You set up this nonprofit at the same time. Then working from anywhere, obviously you're sitting there, not traveling as you would like to, setting up a new business. Well, that must have been a little bit challenging for you and your wife potentially because you are such huge travelers.
Well, you've got to kind of go back to, with CultureMee. What happened was we pivoted to business travel. We stopped the app and launched an API in the US in about April 2019. Got a great reaction from a number of big companies, including BCD Travel, the second biggest travel management company in the world. They asked us to
Great.
pitch this and to present it to their top 500 biggest companies in the world. I think it was in Atlanta. I think it was in July 2019, or Miami, I think. So we got there, we got a great reaction there. And meanwhile, one of their biggest customers, Ernst & Young, we ended up basically engaging with them in South America, presenting to their regional team. So it went really well, got a chance to pitch and present the idea to their global travel team. Meanwhile, got through tech due diligence of BCD Travel, and we were on the cusp, in the middle of negotiations with the likes of EY and a couple of others. And then the pandemic hit, and
Oh,
you
no.
couldn't have picked a worse industry to be a startup in.
Oh,
Having
no.
thrown $250,000 euros of our own money into the business,
Oh,
and
no.
years of hard work and research and pain and all this, and then having two little babies in the middle of it, and then that happens, that was
Oh, that's brutal.
soul destroying. That was soul destroying. So I ended up having to, it was clear. I mean, clearly we weren't the only ones, and there was a lot of
Right.
even, very well-established travel businesses that got blown to pieces.
Right.
And so I ended up I more or less took about 4 or 5 months of just totally switching off, rebuilding brick by brick the mind, body, heart, and soul. And essentially, that's what happened. What happened then was, as I began to recover, I spent a lot of time with the family. I ended up doing some consultancy on the side and was helping all these entrepreneurs and CEOs and different companies and their backgrounds. And I said to myself, I still got this burning desire. I still have the capability. And I said to myself, look, let's keep an eye out for opportunities. And that's what happened. Basically,
Right.
2.5 years ago, came up with the concept of work from anywhere, and it kind of went from there.
That sounds like it was a very, very challenging time. So I apologize for going so deep into that, but it's meaningful. Working from anywhere really draws on so much of that incredibly detailed, process-oriented operational aspect. This is very powerful for where so many companies are that are embracing where we are and the desire and the ability for their employees and non-employees to be working in different places. Please explain the concept for working from anywhere, because for me, it's not just a business, it's really a mindset about the future of work and being able to set up the framework that allows people to work with more freedom than they have in the past. But there are many different aspects of work that are complicated that need to be taken care of.
Well, the concept or kind of the mission behind it is that, the number one obstacle that's preventing, tens, if not hundreds of millions of people around the world from accessing the opportunity to be able to work in a distributed way or to be able to hire in a distributed way is essentially compliance. And it's mainly taxes. But if you can turn that obstacle around from an obstacle into an opportunity
Right.
using technology, well, then two things happen. First of all, companies can at least have a better understanding of how they can get to yes or no.
Right.
And likewise, individuals then, because of the companies having more comfort with it, with the compliance piece of it, can also then get the opportunity to be able to temporarily work in a different country, or even to be just hired in the country of where they're close to their family, for example, and have the opportunity to work for some of these great companies around the world. And the problem is essentially the how. How do you do that can really depend in all sorts of different reasons, scenarios. The how can be sometimes a legal entity, where you need to open a legal entity. The how can sometimes mean it's an employer of record is the answer. The how can be sometimes it's a hire someone who's an independent contractor. And lastly, for temporary work from anywhere, sometimes the how is a digital nomad visa. And it really depends on so many factors, on tax, immigration, employment law, and many others. And so that's what we've built. We basically have built a platform that automates the how. It tells you what the risks are. It tells you if you can or cannot do it, and then it tells you how.
For an employee or freelancer and for an employer?
It's for companies. It's primarily for companies. And by fixing for these companies, then by definition, it will also end up helping the individual employees or contractors, whoever it might be, that will be able to access those opportunities,
And what kinds of companies right now are you finding that are trying to enable that for their employees? Is there a particular type, a particular size, particular countries?
There is. So there's two major threads that are going on here in the future of work. There's the first one is companies that right now it's a big pain point. Companies that are getting a lot of requests from employees to be able to work temporarily in a different country. Somebody wants to go work in Spain for a couple of weeks or months. Can they do it? You see, for example, Spotify, they announced their work from anywhere policy, and a year later, they had a 15% reduction in attrition, higher D&I results, things like that, for example. So
Right.
for some companies, particularly those that embrace remote work, there can be business benefits here. I would say that is a pain point right now. What we're seeing is over the next 10 years, we're seeing a shift on another stream, which is essentially to be able to structurally hire somebody remotely from a different jurisdiction where you may or may not
Without
have
having
legal
a remote office.
Exactly.
On a person-by-person basis.
Exactly. So the companies that we deal with typically have between 1 and maybe 50,000 employees. They tend to be in North America and Europe, but also beyond it and around the world. And what happens is that they typically, for example, might have entities in maybe 15 or 20 countries, which is great. They might have those strategic talent hubs. But they're looking at the other 200 countries in the world. They're saying, hold on a second here. We don't necessarily want to open ourselves up to every country in the world, but you know what? Maybe there's another 50 countries we want to be able to tap into to deepen our talent pool.
Here and there.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Or maybe it could be to have a deeper talent pool, to reduce their workforce costs. It could be to get close to customers. There's varying different motivations, but the biggest one is to be able to access a deeper talent pool,
Okay.
And so that's probably the one that is a bit, we're in the early wave of that. Like scale-ups and startups are embracing that. But the bigger companies are starting to wrap their heads around it. So I would say temporary work from anywhere is a pain point right now for big companies, but it's that structural hire from anywhere. That's the big one. That's the kind of tidal wave that will cause companies to really think about where they source talent and how they do it.
That's interesting to me. That the first thing is because of the request of people to be able to do that, because you and I met at the conference Running Remote. It was great for me to see, for example, the city of Buenos Aires coming and pitching their city for remote workers. That was an aha moment for me. They're really saying, if you come and you work as a digital nomad, you'll get this visa, you'll get a month off your first subway rides. That was definitely showing the way of the future, that digital nomads is one piece of it. Then what you're talking about is so many more people are wanting to have that experience. And I do so deeply believe from my own experiences that living and working in another country is extraordinarily mind-opening in terms of not just visiting a country. That's great, that's important, but really living and trying to work in that country. So it's great to hear that this is something that so many more people are pushing for and that companies are trying to meet those demands.
Well, I give you one of the things that's really blew my mind is when you look into this from a destination perspective. If you have, let's say, you're Buenos Aires or you're Barcelona or whichever country you're in. One of the things that's interesting is if you look at, for example, the type of tourists, a lot of countries, other destinations are rethinking the type of tourists that are coming in. And if you think about it for a second, if you have a choice between on the one hand over here, you've got stag and hen parties who cause a lot of friction, don't generate much revenue. They'll generate revenue from the bars, and that's about it.
Right.
And you've got cruise passengers who don't even stay in a location, and they don't spend very much because they've got their food all on board, but they'll actually visit and cause a lot of, let's say, friction in the high traffic in the kind of the most busiest areas. Or you've got digital nomads, remote workers who can be more distributed. They can work in rural areas. They'll stay for longer. They'll typically want to learn a bit more about the culture. The destinations are looking at that and going, well, there's clearly more of a business case over here. So even if, for example, you offer some tax benefits for income tax, the VAT receipts you're going to get, the property taxes, there's other receipts like that, you'll gain a lot more from that and less friction. And you'll be able to spread more economically the benefits of tourism more widely around the country if you do it right. Right. So there's some of the kind of business cases that destinations are looking at when it comes to this future of work dimension.
So that's why the interest is having particular hubs, because then you're spreading the benefits and reducing the friction, because I hadn't realized until very recently, somebody was sharing with me about the friction that the cruises don't come in and spend a lot of money. There's very little benefit and there's is mostly downside.
I was in Palma in Mallorca myself only literally the weekend before last, and you had 3 giant cruise ships and you couldn't literally walk anywhere during the day in Palma. It was so busy. It was so bustling. It was hard to maneuver. It was nearly suffocating. But then literally after like 6 or 7 p.m., once the cruise passengers went away, it was lovely. It was relaxed. It was a nice place to go and have a bite to eat. The tours can be different. Now, to be fair, cruise passengers, I'm not saying get rid of all cruise passengers, not at all. But I am saying there is a shift. You're seeing how Amsterdam, you're seeing how some places in Spain are saying, look, we want to put a cap on certain types of tourists so we can focus on quality versus quantity.
Yes, it's interesting. And there's a level of complexity, obviously, in the compliance. Not only have you worked it out, but also all these countries are taking great steps. And I've been surprised, I must say, at the speed with which this has been happening. I think probably the middle of the fall 22, there were about 13 countries, maybe 15 countries, which had digital nomad visas. And by January, it's 53 or 55. I mean, it has moved very quickly. Where are we now? And what more are you seeing in terms of how those initial digital nomad and distributed work visas are changing, and also the numbers of countries that are expanding their offers?
Yeah, so there's two kind of twin developments here that are really accelerating that future of international remote work. And the first one is exactly that, digital nomad visas. I mean, there's now, I think, over 50, to the best of my knowledge, of some sort of full or hybrid digital nomad visas. And it's definitely fair to say that the ones that came out initially, a lot of the ones that came out initially were incomplete. They had some gaps in them. You had, in some cases, they were more of a residency rather than being full on digital nomad visas. Some of them had tax components, some didn't. Some had a lack of clarity. In some cases, there was digital nomad visas that were launched by the immigration and tourist authorities, but hadn't fully aligned with their tax authorities in the same country. And so I think there was, and sometimes they were rushed out, but they weren't really promoted because they were brought out, but then they said, no, let's stick with our leisure travel or our traditional tourism. And it didn't quite get the support in some cases, but some of them did very well. Like in the case of Barbados, literally a year after they launched it, they had over $100 million of generated for the local economy since they launched a digital visa. So you can imagine, like they had a huge drop off from cruise passengers because of COVID, obviously. Launching this really helped to mitigate a lot of the shortfall from cruise passengers. So that's on one piece. So I'd say nowadays, the ones that are coming out, they're much better designed. They're much more thought through, for example. And certainly the countries that have tourism as a high percentage of GDP, they really are looking at these as strategic kind of levers to attract remote workers to their country. But then separately, the other dimension that you have is employees of record.
Please explain that a little bit.
So yeah, employees of record are, for example, let's say you're a company and you want to hire, for example, 5 developers. It could be, for example, in Ireland, yeah? And you don't want to have to set up a legal entity quite yet, or maybe you will in 2 or 3 years. But for now, you just want to be able to hire those 2 or 3 developers right now. In that scenario, if employees of record are compatible with the local legislation, and for you, if they make business sense, if they're not in very high risk roles that might be sales generating or senior roles, then they can be a brilliant tool for companies to use to quickly scale up the talent in different countries, for example. So let's say, for example, you've got a fantastic developer, you need to get an offer into them. You need to get them started on a really important project very quickly. This can be a great way to get going very, very quickly. And what's beautiful then about the model is that if you end up deciding to set up a legal entity in 2 or 3 years' time, that's no problem. You can just transfer them from the employer of record to the legal entity. So I would say they're a tool in the toolbox. You need to know when and when not to use them. And then if it's interesting from the destination or country perspective, you could think of it like use the digital nomad visa to get people visiting the country, get them familiar with the country, partner with employers of record to then get companies hiring people structurally in that country, for example. And then once, on that kind of chain, then use your FDI, your foreign direct investment agencies to then really get them to incentivize them to set up legal entities in that country. And so all of a sudden then you've got like a remote work kind of a channel where you're able to bring people and bring companies along the journey to ultimately get them along that FDI journey where you can get them to structurally base themselves from that country. So we're seeing some countries and some parts of the world are doing that,
Interesting. So this is now a new type of way to be expanding presence in a country, taking some baby steps, exploring it in different ways, then seeing what makes sense for your company. In this very unpredictable marketplace, when we're not sure what's going to happen and how and what's going to be best, and is this market going to be better than that, and what products and Gen AI and all the rest of it, having this type of more flexible framework to be able to explore expansion in different ways, that sounds like an enormous opportunity.
No, absolutely.
One thing I haven't mentioned yet is the new partnership that you have with Mercer. That's a huge thing for your company, and it's very exciting.
Oh yeah, Mercer, one of the biggest HR consultancies in the world, and they firmly believe that the future of work is one where companies will embrace an agile, distributed, global talent pool. And for that, you need the tools to be able to go along with it. And that's why our technology solution fits so nicely in that. And for us, we're absolutely delighted with the partnership and very excited about it.
Oh, that's so great. So let's now address perhaps the elephant in the room or distributed elephants in the room. You mentioned that you've actually just been presenting to some folks in the United States about the possible trajectories for distributed work for different companies. I'm very curious in terms of what you presented, what your thoughts are, and what you see as the sentiment in different areas, not just Silicon Valley, the US, and Europe as well.
Well, I think for me, if I was to try and summarize it, pre-pandemic, how happy were we all with management practices around the world? And I think it's fair to say, after hundreds of years of iterating and testing and books and education, university, we were still figuring it out. Some companies are doing it better than others, but I think on average, if I was to give us all a score, we'd probably give ourselves somewhere between a 5 out of 10, maybe, and maybe a 7 out of 10. And some companies, maybe a 0 out of 10. And so obviously then we had probably one of the greatest shifts in the history of companies and management and personal life in certainly 50 years, I'm guessing, maybe 100 years, pick your number. And what's clear is that, we're still figuring this out.
For sure.
And it's clear that there's some companies are doing this better than others. I think what is fair to say is that, we were at Nick Bloom, as we both know, has got great data. He had, at the very peak of the pandemic, we were about maybe over 60% of work from home days in the US, for example, and it's pared back down to maybe just under 30% of percentage of full, let's say, paid full days work from home. So, of course, some companies will be 5 days work from home, some will be 0, some will be hybrid in between, but it seems to be the blended average is, give or take, on average about just under 30%. Having come from a peak of just over 60%, let's say. So, where do I think that's going to go? Well, I think one of the reasons is that a lot of companies, they went into fully remote with the pandemic, and then they tried to call people back to the office, basically, and they're working their way through how to operate in a hybrid culture. It seems to be most companies do seem to be going for that hybrid mix where they can, basically. But doing that is tricky because you're having to manage the in-office experience, you have to manage the online experience or work from home experience. It's not easy, and so I'd say this is a challenge for a lot of companies, and we're going to work right through it. And I mean, for me, I would call myself as somebody who's very balanced about remote. I love working for remote for me personally, but for companies, managing, for example, younger team members, onboarding, coaching, mentoring them, that's certainly one of the gaps that we have to address. But in general, I mean, for me, I feel that this is a tremendously empowering thing. And for a lot of people, it's great. But I also recognize that our greatest moments are in person. So even the best remote work teams, that work remotely, they find these great moments to meet at company retreats or meet in person as well. So finding that balance is a journey that companies and society, we're going to be going on. And I do think there's going to be some rapid learnings. But I mean, I do feel if we're at 30% now, I do feel we probably will, if I was to guesstimate, inch up towards 35, 40% in the years to come as companies get out of these office leases, which, as we know, is quite tricky. There's a lot of companies are stuck into long-term office leases. So for me, that's how I suspect. But again, who knows? It's tricky to look into the crystal ball.
Yes, it is a crystal ball, as well as the fact that these trends have been going for a long time. And while Nick Bloom and Kate Listis have their data shows that prior to the pandemic, 5% of working days were fully working from home. However, that said, there was an enormous amount of informal flexibility. So people were working in different ways, and this has been the trend for a long time. There are so many people who do benefit in very specific ways because of their different obligations or potentially disabilities from these different type of arrangements, as well as helping people do their best work. I'm very excited about the future and the fact that working from anywhere is dealing with some of the gnarly aspects of the compliance to smooth some of the easiest ways to say no. John, what haven't I asked you about potentially where we're going with this distributed work future? To do with working from anywhere, to do with our mindsets about it, to do with the challenges that employers are putting in front of themselves, or whatever you think.
Well, I think one of the things that I'm really curious about, the two things that jump out at me. The first one is in the 90s, countries used corporation tax to attract companies. And that worked well for a lot of companies, such as Ireland, but many others. Whereas in this new world of work, just because you cut the ribbon on a head office, does that mean people are going to relocate from around the world? It's not. But what that means, and how do you attract individuals? Individuals now become much more mobile. And so then countries that, for example, had a high marginal income tax rate, they're going to find that tricky. So for me, what I don't want to get to is a race to the bottom on income tax. We need to have a balanced approach, a balanced discussion on this. But that's going to present a challenge because we have to make sure, there's an equity and fairness in our systems. We have to pay for our hospitals and our roads and our schools, for example. That's one aspect. But then the other aspect of it as well that presents challenges and opportunities is the future of kids' education. So for me, I'm very, very excited for, if you want to work in a different country for a couple of months, that prevents a great cultural education for kids. But then how do traditional education systems deal with this? Some are very strict. Some are very much bricks and mortar. If you're out for more than a day or two, you get penalized. There's results go down. So that becomes also interesting discussion as well. So those two twin aspects of, taxes and what it means for society, but then similarly, then the education piece is absolutely fascinating as well. They'd be the ones that really jump out at me. And the last one then for me separately is initiatives where they're looking to create countries on the internet. So these are projects like Plumia. Plumia is fascinating. It's like they're trying to create a country on the internet. You say, oh, no, that's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. One of the things we covered in Plumia recently was how in Native American tribes, for example, they have their own certain zones, economic zones, or you also special economic zones in certain countries. Where, for example, you can actually have your own tax and other, let's say, authorities to be able to operate separately economically within a country. So there's some very exciting projects out there that are going on that are certainly catching our attention.
I guess that captures some of the people who aren't effectively resident anywhere. They aren't 180 days in any particular country. So that's one way for them to be anchored. Right?
Yeah, so this is where it gets fascinating for me, and it's only at the early stages of these movements, but are these people out there that are trying to see, is it possible to create a digital country? How would you do that? How would you create a community? How would you deal with visas and immigration and taxes and whatnot? And so that's something that really is a bit of a mind bender. It's one that you go, well, I don't quite get it, but they're very exciting projects for the future of work, of the future of countries, of the future of tax, that immigration, that raise an awful lot of questions, but they're very, very exciting for me. I like being involved in these kind of projects that push the edge of something, that push the boundaries. Yeah,
for sure. From the visionary and really out there, getting very practical, the last thing that I ask is, what can an employer do if they've received a bunch of requests from their employees and or they just want to provide that as a new option? I think it's less than 30 days is the key for most countries. But what are the things that they can do tomorrow to be able to increase or expand their offerings in terms of being able to work from anywhere?
Well, the first thing is there's great research reports and benchmarking data out there to help give them a good basis. On our website, we have our own Work From Anywhere white paper. There's also Benevo. If you search for Benevo, who have a great white paper as well on some of the benchmarks and global mobility for what companies are offering for Work From Anywhere days and whatnot. And then to speak to, if you already have a tax provider, for example, or immigration provider, have a chat with them. Have a chat with them about these new models such as digital nomad visas. If you've got good employment lawyers, have a chat to them about employers of record. Or if you don't deal with them, we've got a list of plenty of good employers of record as well. There's plenty of good ones out there that are experiencing exponential growth. They're certainly worth a chat to about having them as a tool in your toolbox. But I think also feel free. We've got some good research reports and articles that could be helpful to help people understand how to navigate this and put together their own policy as well.
Well, thank you so much, John, for sharing everything that you have today. I know that you're not living in Ireland anymore. I know that you're coming to us from Portugal, right?
That's right. Yeah, I'm here in Portugal. We've been in Portugal, Ireland, Phuket, and the Netherlands in the last 4 years alone. So we're well traveled. And my youngest, my eldest daughter, Rosa, she's 6 and she's been to 26 countries already. So that'll give you a good idea.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for sharing that too, and all your insights. And there'll be all kinds of information in the show notes. If you as an employer or an employee are interested in working from anywhere, then John and his company are really helping enable that and enable the future of work in that aspect. So thank you so much, John.
Thank you so much, Sophie. It was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me on today.
Thank you again so much to John Lee, CEO and founder of Work From Anywhere. You can follow John on LinkedIn and find out more about his company Work From Anywhere at wfa.team. Immediate action tip. If your company is interested to offer international remote working options, Review useful white papers for benchmarks about global mobility. Chat with a tax or immigration provider and a good employment lawyer about new international working models. If you enjoyed this podcast, why not tell a friend as well as like it? And do please write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular video updates, curated articles, research and information, follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter at @ASophieWade. For more information to help navigate this period of transformation, you can also sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter on LinkedIn and my blog, which is available on sophiewade.com and flexelnetwork.com. Until next time.